Florence had barely taken 2 steps away from her grandfather's casket when her mother's voice cut through the silence. "Don't wander too far," Margaret said loudly enough for half the chapel to hear. "You'll want to stay and watch the family receive what your grandfather left us." Several relatives chuckled. Florence slowly turned around. 9 years had passed since she'd last stood in the same room as most of them, yet nothing had changed. Her mother still wore the same confident smile. Her brother Kevin still crossed his arms as if daring anyone to challenge him. Vanessa stood beside them, avoiding Florence's eyes while pretending she wasn't part of the humiliation. Kevin smirked. "I'm honestly surprised you showed up. I figured people who betray their family usually stay away from funerals." Florence tightened her grip on the funeral program, but said nothing. Margaret stepped closer. "You lost the right to call him Grandpa the day you walked away from this family." The words hung in the air. Before Florence could answer, the attorney cleared his throat from the front of the chapel. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, "Mr. Harold Whitmore instructed that no one leave today until his final wishes have been read exactly as written." Margaret's expression immediately softened into confidence. "Perfect," she whispered to Kevin. "Let's finish this." She had no idea the next hour was about to destroy everything she had built over the last 9 years. The funeral service had ended only minutes earlier. While guests slowly gathered near the front of the chapel, Florence remained alone in the last row where she'd quietly sat throughout the ceremony. She had arrived before sunrise to help the funeral director arrange Grandpa's favorite white lilies, organize family photographs, and make sure every guest had a memorial booklet. Not one member of her family had acknowledged her. Instead, Margaret moved through the crowd accepting condolences like the grieving matriarch, repeatedly telling distant relatives, "Dad always knew family came first." Every time Florence heard those words, she remembered the day she had been thrown out of her childhood home with nothing but a single suitcase. Now the same people who had erased her from their lives stood only a few feet away discussing Grandpa's $42 million estate as though the inheritance already belonged to them. "I wonder which vacation house I'll take," Kevin laughed. Vanessa smiled. "Mom deserves the main estate. Grandpa always intended that." Margaret nodded proudly. "We're his only real family." Several relatives glanced toward Florence before quickly looking away. One elderly cousin leaned toward another and whispered, "Why is she even here? She hasn't been part of this family for years." Florence lowered her eyes. She hadn't come for money. She had come because, despite everything, she had loved her grandfather until his final breath. The attorney quietly carried a thick leather portfolio to the podium before removing a sealed envelope. Margaret folded her arms confidently. "This won't take long." The attorney looked around the chapel before speaking. "My client instructed me to read one handwritten letter before discussing a single dollar of his estate." The room fell completely silent as he carefully broke the seal and unfolded the first page. Grandpa's handwriting filled the first page in steady, deliberate strokes. "If you are hearing these words, then I am finally at peace. But before anyone speaks about my money, they will first hear about my family." The attorney paused only long enough for the room to settle before continuing. "For 9 years, I watched people I loved stop speaking to one another. Some chose comfort over truth. One chose truth over comfort." Florence's fingers tightened around the funeral program. She hadn't expected to hear her grandfather's voice echoed so clearly through his words. Margaret sighed loudly. "This has nothing to do with the estate." The attorney looked up. "Mrs. Whitmore, your father specifically instructed that no one interrupt this letter. If anyone does, I am to stop the reading until order is restored." A few guests turned toward Margaret. Embarrassed, she folded her arms but remained silent. The attorney continued. 9 years ago, I watched my granddaughter Florence leave our family home carrying one suitcase. I remember standing at my window after everyone left. She looked back 3 times before walking away." Florence swallowed hard. She had never known Grandpa had seen that moment. The memory came rushing back. She had been 24 when she uncovered irregular payments hidden inside the family's construction business. At first, she thought it was a bookkeeping mistake. Instead, she discovered money had quietly disappeared over several years. When she confronted her mother privately, Margaret's face had gone pale. "Close the files," she had whispered. Florence frowned. "Mom, these numbers don't make sense." "They don't need to." Florence had stared at her. "If someone audits this company, there won't be an audit." When Florence refused to ignore what she'd found, everything changed. Margaret gathered the family before Florence had the chance to explain anything. Kevin never asked a single question. "So you're trying to destroy Dad's company," he accused. "I never said that." Vanessa shook her head in disappointment. "I can't believe you do this to us." Florence tried explaining that she simply wanted the records corrected before anyone got hurt. Nobody listened. By the end of the evening, she had been labeled greedy, disloyal, and dangerous. Her own mother pointed toward the front door. "If protecting strangers matters more than protecting your family," Margaret said coldly, "then leave." Florence remembered waiting for someone, anyone, to stop her. No one did. The attorney turned another page. Many people believed Florence abandoned this family. He paused. The truth is, she was the one abandoned. Silence spread across the chapel. Several relatives shifted uncomfortably. An elderly aunt slowly lowered her eyes. Margaret clenched her jaw. "Father never wrote that," she muttered. The attorney calmly lifted the original pages. "The handwriting has already been authenticated as part of the probate process." No one answered. Florence remembered the first winter after being disowned. She worked mornings at a bakery, afternoons cleaning offices, and nights studying accounting certifications to rebuild her career. Birthdays passed without phone calls. Christmas cards stopped arriving. When relatives saw her in public, they looked away. The hardest part wasn't losing the family business. It was believing she'd lost Grandpa too. Until one rainy afternoon, nearly 2 years later. She had been leaving a grocery store when she heard a familiar voice. "Florence." She turned. Grandpa stood beside his old pickup truck with an umbrella in one hand. For several seconds, neither of them spoke. Then he smiled. "You look like someone who hasn't had lunch." She burst into tears. From that day forward, they met quietly every few weeks. Sometimes it was breakfast. Sometimes it was coffee. Sometimes they simply sat on a park bench watching children play. Grandpa never asked about the family arguments. He never mentioned inheritance. Instead, he always ended every visit with the same sentence. "Character doesn't need applause, Florence. It only needs time." Back inside the chapel, the attorney read the next paragraph. "If you believe this letter is only about the past, you misunderstand why I wrote it." Margaret leaned forward. "What exactly does that mean?" The attorney looked directly at her before lowering his eyes back to the page. "I believe," he said quietly, "the next section answers that question." The attorney adjusted his glasses before continuing. "Too many people confuse inheritance with entitlement. They believe sharing my name automatically earns them what I spent a lifetime building. They are mistaken." A murmur spread across the chapel. Margaret's confident smile faded for the first time. "What is he talking about?" one cousin whispered. The attorney continued reading. "Family is not measured by blood alone. It is measured by presence when there is nothing to gain." Several guests exchanged uneasy glances. Everyone knew who had regularly visited Grandpa during his final years. Almost no one had. Margaret suddenly stood. "My father was elderly. Someone clearly influenced him." The attorney didn't respond immediately. Instead, he reached into his portfolio and placed a thick binder on the podium. Its spine was labeled. Visitation records. Another binder followed. Medical appointments. Then another. Personal correspondence. The room fell silent. My client instructed me, the attorney said calmly, to expect accusations before appreciation. Margaret slowly sat back down. The attorney opened the first binder. These are the visitor logs maintained by Maple Grove, assisted living over the last 7 years. He read several dates aloud. March 14, visitor Florence Whitmore. April 2, visitor Florence Whitmore. April 19, visitor Florence Whitmore. The list continued. Nearly every week. Sometimes twice in 1 week. Then he stopped. I'll now read the visits made by immediate family. He turned several pages. Margaret Whitmore. He paused. 3 visits. Someone near the front gasped. Kevin frowned. That can't be right. The attorney looked directly at the records. 3 documented visits in 7 years. He continued. Kevin Whitmore. Another pause. 2 visits. Vanessa lowered her head before the attorney even spoke again. Vanessa Whitmore. 4 visits. No one said a word. The silence had become heavier than any accusation. The attorney reached for another document. These are payment records authorized by Mr. Whitmore. Margaret crossed her arms. Finally. But the attorney wasn't finished. Several medical treatments were declined by Mr. Whitmore because he believed they were too expensive. Florence looked up. She remembered those conversations. Grandpa always insisted he was fine. The attorney continued. Each time, those treatments were quietly paid for by someone else. He looked toward Florence. The payments were made anonymously. Margaret immediately pointed across the room. So she bought his affection. Florence stood for the first time that afternoon. No. Everyone turned toward her. I paid because he was my grandfather. She swallowed. I never expected him to repay me. Her voice remained steady. I would have done exactly the same thing if he'd left me absolutely nothing. The room became completely still. No rehearsed speech. No anger. Just a simple truth. Several guests who had quietly judged Florence now looked visibly uncomfortable. An elderly family friend slowly nodded. I believe her. Another relative added softly. So do I. Margaret looked around in disbelief as support quietly shifted away from her. Kevin slammed his hand against the pew. This is ridiculous. He pointed directly at Florence. You've been planning this for years. Florence met his eyes. If I wanted Grandpa's money, I would have reminded him every time I visited. She shook her head. We never talked about inheritance. What did you talk about then? She smiled sadly. His garden. A few people laughed quietly through their tears. And his favorite baseball team, she continued. And the books he wanted me to read, mostly. He just wanted someone to listen. Kevin had no response. The attorney closed the visitor log and placed both hands on another sealed envelope. My client anticipated today's accusations. Across the front, written in Grandpa's unmistakable handwriting, were the words, Open only if my family QSTONS, why I made my DCSONS. The attorney carefully broke the seal. He looked slowly around the chapel before speaking. Everything you are about to hear. He paused. Is supported by evidence. The attorney carefully unfolded the documents inside the sealed envelope. Unlike Grandpa's personal letter, these pages were organized into separate folders, each bearing dates, signatures, and notarized certifications. This, the attorney said calmly, is the evidence Mr. Whitmore spent nearly a decade collecting. No one moved. Margaret forced a laugh. My father always kept paperwork. That proves nothing. The attorney looked at her without emotion. Let's see what your father believed it proved. He opened the first folder. 9 years ago, he began, Mr. Whitmore hired an independent forensic accounting firm. Kevin's head snapped up. What? The attorney held up the report. After learning there had been serious disagreements regarding the family business, he commissioned a confidential review. He read directly from the findings. No evidence was found that Florence Whitmore altered financial records or attempted to steal company assets. Another page followed. Evidence, instead, indicates deliberate concealment of unauthorized withdrawals made over an extended period. A wave of whispers swept through the chapel. Margaret's face lost its color. That report is incomplete. The attorney calmly turned another page. The review identifies who approved those withdrawals. He didn't read the names immediately. Instead, he laid the report on the podium where several relatives seated near the front could clearly see the signatures. One elderly uncle covered his mouth. Oh, my God. The attorney continued. Mr. Whitmore requested a second independent audit 6 months later. He held up another report. It reached the same conclusion. Kevin shifted nervously. This doesn't prove Florence was innocent. It does considerably more than that, the attorney replied. He opened Grandpa's handwritten journal. The next document explains why these reports remained private. He began reading. I wanted the truth before I accused anyone. Once I had it, I realized the greatest theft wasn't the missing money. It was watching my own family sacrifice an innocent girl to protect themselves. Every eye slowly turned toward Margaret. She looked at Kevin. Kevin stared at the floor. Vanessa began breathing faster. The attorney opened another folder. This contains correspondence between Mr. Whitmore and the accounting investigators. He selected one letter. My client specifically asked one question. He read aloud. Did Florence know Kevin would face criminal liability if the irregularities became public? The attorney turned the page. The investigators responded. No, interviews indicate Florence requested only that the books be corrected internally before any authorities became involved. A stunned silence settled over the chapel. Florence closed her eyes. That was exactly what she had begged for. She had never wanted anyone arrested. She had only wanted the truth acknowledged. Margaret suddenly stood. Kevin made mistakes. Her voice trembled. He was young. A cousin frowned. He was 30. Margaret ignored him. I was protecting my son. Florence slowly looked at her mother. You destroyed your daughter. Margaret couldn't answer. For the first time in 9 years, there was nothing left to blame on anyone else. The attorney opened Grandpa's final journal. His voice softened. The day Florence left our home, she believed I had chosen the rest of the family over her. Florence felt tears gathering. She never knew I began investigating everything the following morning. Another page. Every lunch we shared after that was never about inheritance. I simply wanted her to know at least one member of this family still believed in her. Several guests quietly wiped away tears. Even people who barely knew Florence could now see the weight she had carried alone. The attorney closed the journal. There is one final matter. He placed a thick legal binder beside the evidence. This contains notarized affidavits, the accounting reports, witness statements, medical records, and video testimony recorded by Mr. Whitmore before his passing. He looked directly at Margaret. If anyone contests this will, every document you've seen today, and many you haven't, will become part of the court record. Margaret's lawyer, seated near the back, slowly stood. He walked to the front, briefly reviewed the binder, then quietly returned to his seat. Without looking at Margaret, he whispered, I wouldn't file this case. Margaret's shoulders slumped. Kevin buried his face in his hands. Vanessa silently cried. The attorney reached for the final sealed packet lying alone on the podium. Across the front were the words, "Last WILL and Testament of Harold W.H.I.T. Mowari." He broke the final seal. "I will now read the distribution of Mr. Whitmore's $42 million estate." The attorney broke the final seal with deliberate care. Every eye in the chapel followed the thick document as he unfolded the first page. No one whispered. No one moved. Margaret sat upright, her confidence slowly returning. "Now," she said quietly, "let's hear what Dad actually wanted." The attorney nodded once. "I am now reading the last will and testament of Harold James Whitmore." He looked down at the page. "Being of sound mind and acting without coercion, I revoke all previous wills and declare this to be my final instruction." He turned another page. "To my daughter, Margaret Whitmore." Margaret smiled. "I leave $1. The smile disappeared. The attorney continued without looking up. "To my grandson, Kevin Whitmore." Another pause. "Is $1. Kevin blinked. "What?" The attorney didn't respond. "To my granddaughter, Vanessa Whitmore." He continued. "Is $1. Vanessa covered her mouth. "No." The room erupted into shocked whispers. Margaret shot to her feet. "This is impossible." The attorney calmly raised his hand. "Your father instructed me to read every explanation in full." He continued. "Margaret, I loved you because you were my daughter, but love does not excuse what you became. You chose appearances over honesty, favoritism over justice, and greed over family. You taught your children that protecting one another mattered more than protecting what was right. I cannot reward that lesson." Margaret's knees nearly gave out. She grabbed the back of a pew to steady herself. The attorney turned another page. "Kevin, I prayed for years that you would admit the truth. Instead, you accepted your sister's sacrifice because it protected your future. $1 is enough to remind you that integrity cannot be purchased." Kevin lowered his head. For the first time since Florence had arrived, he couldn't look at anyone. The attorney continued. "Vanessa, you never created the lie, but you helped keep it alive. Silence is not innocence when it protects injustice." Vanessa quietly sobbed. "I should have listened," she whispered. "I should have listened to her." The attorney nodded before opening the final section. "To my beloved granddaughter, Florence Whitmore." Florence instinctively looked down. She didn't want the room watching her. "I leave my primary residence, every investment account under my name, my commercial properties, my business holdings, my personal collections, and the remainder of my estate, valued at approximately $42 million. Gasps echoed throughout the chapel. The attorney continued. "I also appoint Florence sole trustee of the Whitmore Family Foundation, because she has already demonstrated the character required to protect what I spent my life building." Florence slowly closed her eyes. The money barely registered. One sentence had already meant more than everything else. She has already demonstrated the character required. Grandpa had trusted her. He always had. Margaret pointed across the chapel. She manipulated him. "No," the attorney replied calmly. He anticipated that accusation. He lifted another notarized statement. "Mr. Whitmore met with me privately every year for the last 6 years to review this will." He placed several signed medical evaluations beside it. Each physician confirmed he was mentally competent. Then he revealed one final document. "This is his written instruction regarding any challenge." He read aloud. "If my family contests this will because they believe Florence influenced me, I direct my attorney to release every journal, audit, financial report, recorded interview, and affidavit collected over the past 9 years. Truth deserves daylight." The room became completely silent. Margaret's attorney slowly stood. He walked to her side and spoke quietly enough that only those nearest could hear. "We're done." She stared at him. What do you mean? We lose. There has to be something. He slowly shook his head. Your father prepared this case better than most litigators. Margaret sank back into the pew. The fight had ended before it could begin. One by one, relatives approached Florence. The elderly aunt, who had once ignored her, reached her first. I'm sorry. Another cousin followed. We believed what we were told. A longtime family friend wiped away tears. Your grandfather talked about you often. Florence smiled softly. He never told me. He was proud of you. Those 4 words nearly broke her. Not because they were new, because she finally heard them aloud. Across the room, Kevin slowly approached. He stopped several feet away. I don't expect forgiveness. Florence waited. I should have asked questions. His voice cracked. I chose the easy answer because it benefited me. Florence nodded. I know. He looked at the floor. I'm sorry. She didn't embrace him. She didn't reject him. She simply said, I hope you become the man Grandpa believed you still could. Kevin silently walked away. Vanessa approached next, tears filling her eyes. I was afraid of Mom. So was I, Florence answered. Neither woman spoke again. Some wounds needed more than one afternoon to heal. Over the following months, Margaret quietly abandoned her plans to challenge the estate after every attorney she consulted reached the same conclusion. Grandpa's evidence was overwhelming. The truth had been documented long before anyone entered a courtroom. Florence honored every promise Grandpa had written into his will. She restored his home instead of selling it. She expanded the Whitmore Family Foundation, creating scholarships for students who chose honesty over convenience and funding financial literacy programs in communities Grandpa cared about. Above her office desk, she framed the final page of Grandpa's handwritten letter. Whenever difficult decisions arose, she read the same closing sentence. Character doesn't always win quickly, but if it remains faithful long enough, the truth eventually speaks louder than every lie. The estate changed Florence's financial future. But it wasn't the greatest gift her grandfather left behind. After 9 years of carrying a burden that wasn't hers, she no longer had to defend her name. As the attorney closed the final file and the mourners quietly departed, Florence looked once more at her grandfather's portrait. For the first time in nearly a decade, she didn't feel abandoned. She felt seen. And she realized the greatest inheritance Grandpa had given her wasn't $42 million. It was a truth so thoroughly protected that no one could ever bury it again.